And coming up next, we are very honored to have a keynote that is delivered by Mr. Gary Rieschel. He's the founding managing director of Qiming Venture Partners on the topic of dynamic of tech venturing and market opportunities in the era of change. Gary will be introduced by Ms. Rebecca Fennon. She is the founder of Silicon Dragon. Everyone, let's welcome Rebecca and Gary. Virtual round of applause.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Fennon. I'm the founder of Silicon Dragon Ventures. I'm pleased to welcome our keynote speaker today, Gary Rieschel, a co-founder and managing partner of Qiming Venture Partners, based in Shanghai and Seattle, and a few other markets as well, Hong Kong and Shenzhen. So Gary, I have known him since the start of Qiming, back in 2006, and I've followed his career ever since then. Back then, Gary told me he was going to be doing a victory lap someday, and I think Gary has done several victory laps by now, because Qiming has emerged as one of the leading US-China venture firms. $6 billion under management, 13 funds, including US and RMB funds, and several offices. And many IPOs and acquisitions to their name. Qiming has done a great job. Gary has led this firm, and Gary is a real thought leader in the business. I can't think of anyone better to deliver our keynote today, because Gary knows tech, he knows the whole issue of China and US, he knows innovation, he knows entrepreneurship, he's done it all. So let's welcome Gary Rieschel to be our keynote speaker for the Cyberport Venture Capital Forum. Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. And I want to thank the organizers of the Cyberport Venture Capital Forum for inviting me to speak today. It's a prestigious event. It highlights the role that Hong Kong plays in that vibrant ecosystem, technology ecosystem, venture capital ecosystem encompassing Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. And again, it's a privilege to be here. The talk that I was asked to give is on the dynamics of venture capital investing in China. But first, I think we're going to have to acknowledge some facts about this year, specifically related to COVID. It's been fascinating to watch the difference between COVID in the US and COVID in China. And I don't necessarily mean the governmental response, although the contrast is quite dramatic. What I really look at is the role, the different responses in the entrepreneurial and venture capital ecosystem. In the US, things slowed down for some significant period of time. In China, the COVID crisis had a minimal impact on the better venture capital firms in China. An example, we started raising our Fund 7 in January. We closed it in April on the original schedule and the original target. And many firms, the firms like Qiming, like Sequoia, et cetera, have had no problem raising money, but other firms have had quite some difficulty this year. In the venture capital investing side, there was a very slow February and March, but beginning in April, at least within the Qiming universe, the firm was pretty much fully back in activity level. And in fact, if you compare 2019 with 2020, there's very little difference in the number of deals that have been reviewed, number of deals that have been approved. The way that we think about the COVID crisis, and this is Qiming US and Qiming China, is it's been an accelerant for material changes across a wide variety of sectors. So you can look at working from home. We're not going to go back to the way things were. Whether China does or not is an interesting question. The US is clearly not going to go back to working in the office buildings the way we had done before. Online education is not going to reduce in the future. That's going to continue to be very, very prominent. Telemedicine and some changes in the healthcare system are going to continue as well. So some of these are more or less relevant to China, but they're all changes that have been very significant and driven by COVID. Qiming had quite a few companies that were involved in responding to the COVID crisis. CanSino's been in the news quite a bit. It's developed one of the leading and most advanced vaccines for COVID based out of China. It's done multinational trials in different geographies and looks in the next several months to have a vaccine that will be in the commercial market. Infravision, which is a leading imaging company, pivoted very quickly in January from having lung cancer imaging, lung tumor imaging, to being able to identify lungs that had COVID infection. Trained on tens of thousands of cases in the Wuhan area, and then now has been installed in providing that in Europe and Japan and the United States as well. We've had several companies in building the reagents for diagnostic testing, and a company in the US fund called Icosavax, which is really developing an entire new platform for vaccine development. So we've been very involved since back in January in terms of a response to the COVID crisis. When we look at the China venture capital industry as it exists today, I'd like to establish a little bit of a context in terms of how we think about that. My deal history in China dates back to 1999. I was helping Chauncey Shea with SoftBank China Venture Capital, was involved with the early SoftBank investments in China. Some of those, such as Alibaba, turned out well, would be an understatement. And I was running SoftBank's venture group, and what was interesting was looking at how really young and nascent the institutional venture capital market was in China, 1999, 2000, 2001. It really wasn't until 2004 and 5 that you started to see an institutional development of venture capital. And what I mean by that was long-term investors, the more traditional venture capital investors in the US, endowments and foundations. And they moved into the China market in that 2005, 2006 timeframe. In those early days, for the foreign capital in China dominated the venture capital industry. The RMB money that was available was really not oriented toward risk capital. In fact, if you look at if you look at 1999 to 2018, look at that 20-year period, over 80% of the capital that was deployed in venture capital risk deals, in other words, true technology risk deals, early stage deals, 80% of that was US dollars. So it wasn't until a number of years that there became more of a mix of RMB and dollars. The capital market evolution has been even more stark. It took much longer than I had expected for China to develop what I'd call real risk-oriented capital market structures, something that was truly a challenger to NASDAQ. But now both the Hong Kong Exchange and the Star Board in China represent real alternatives to NASDAQ for technology and early healthcare companies. That's a significant change and has had a material impact in terms of where the more entrepreneurial and more technologically innovative companies in China have been able to list. An example, Qiming has had 10 IPOs this year, and 9 of the 10 have been on the Star Board of the Hong Kong Exchange. And virtually all of those companies 5 years ago would have been looking at NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. When we start to plug in the factor of US-China relations into the equation and its venture capital, its impact on venture capital, clearly there have been discussions in the US about restricting dollar flows into China. Thus far, that has not really affected the venture capital industry. A number of the large LPs that Qiming has have had discussions with us about talking to their boards relative to the issues now associated with China and whether or not they're going to be affected by the US, any changes in US policy. Thus far, we have not really seen that. China's been pushing very hard for technology independence from the US, partly because of the rhetoric coming from the US side and some of the activities against particular Chinese companies. So there's been an undercurrent as to whether or not you should be listing in the US. There's been an undercurrent as to whether US money should continue to go into China. You've still had quite a few significant listings this year in the US. You've still had significant capital go from the US to China. But it's another part of the conversation now that for more than a decade was really not a concern. China's pushing very hard on this technology independence, and it's important to understand where China's focus is. China's focus is not on basic research. The way that we think about invention in the United States as really being innovative, you don't see that much pure invention in China. What you see is a great deal of innovation. You see an invention that is taken and modified specifically for the Chinese market. and that goes through multiple cycles and winds up looking quite different than it started. But the original invention wasn't necessarily in China. So this focus on applied research and not basic research, and the focus on deployment and not development are really distinguishing characteristics of what the Chinese innovative system is. Examples of where we're seeing this really take off today in China, and we look at these as new infrastructure systems. So when we're looking at investment areas for Qiming, healthcare, and technology, you look at where these broad-based systems are being developed. 5G is obviously one. There's the 5G technology, but there's an entire ecosystem around 5G. Too much of the focus has been on Huawei. Too much of the focus has been on the switch. That's a relatively small part of the entire ecosystem and infrastructure that needs to be in place for 5G to be really ubiquitous and broadly used. Data center technology in China, driven a little bit by the fact that they don't want to be dependent on overseas technology in this area. Huge amount of investment in data center technology, ultra high voltage transmission for electricity. China is clearly the world leader in that area. Again, it didn't invent the technology, but the kind of deployments that China's put in place across the country have really been quite remarkable. And so that's an area where they're clearly the leading country in the world now in terms of real deployment. Autonomous vehicles and testing. The US has backed off some of that testing. China has accelerated that testing. There are entire road systems in China that are really established for those vehicles to be tested. So you're talking about tens of thousands of units a day on the roads in China being tested in that way. And there's a great deal of learning, obviously, doing that earlier in the cycle. Gene and cell therapy, there are more trials in China on cell and gene therapy than there are in the United States. Again, there's a real learning curve when you're looking at the deployment of these technologies, and China's willingness to aggressively deploy has put them very, very far up that learning curve, or further up that learning curve than virtually every other country. Again, so the thing that you want to take away from that is that the venture capital ecosystem in China has been very practical, very pragmatic, and very much focused on the deployment and the applied side as opposed to the basic research. When you think about China's entrepreneurs and how they have navigated the last period of time, the pace of recovery in China has been very fast. We can see that in the capital that's being deployed into entrepreneurs. We can see that in follow-on rounds from existing entrepreneurs. We can see that in the kind of risk capital that's going into new sectors. It's important to remember why. Chinese entrepreneurs are incredibly comfortable dealing with ambiguity at both scale and speed. And in this environment where it used to be that they were dealing with uncertainty in the Chinese system itself. Government regulations were complicated, the listing requirements were complicated, whether you could hire a team was complicated. And that created a situation where they became very adept at navigating this uncertainty. The COVID crisis just brought that forward, accelerated many technology developments, and again, created a great deal of uncertainty, which actually suits the Chinese entrepreneurs very, very well. So this year, I think that above any other entrepreneurial group in China, or any entrepreneurial group in the world, the Chinese entrepreneurs have really been the ones that have stood out and been able to leverage that new normal. By the way, just as an aside, I'm not sure there ever is going to be a normal again, or it'll take a very long time for us to arrive at that. But the Chinese entrepreneurs have been able to deal with this uncertainty and have had extraordinary results this year. To talk a little bit about Qiming. Qiming has 70 people, along with the $6 billion that Rebecca mentioned under management. 70 people in China. We have an office in Hong Kong that has Nisa Lung and Grace Lee as the two partners. Nisa heads up the healthcare practice. Grace does all of our finance. We have a focus on tech and healthcare. Historically, it was about 55, 60% in tech, 35, 40% in healthcare. That's pretty much flipped now. So right now we're running about 60% in healthcare and about 40% in tech. The healthcare sector has continued to expand, and we're very broad, investing in everything from cell therapy, gene therapy, therapeutics to diagnostics, devices, and services. The tech team has become more focused on core technology. Our belief is that many of the large consumer plays that are more focused on business model development, they've either gotten big enough that they don't need early stage capital where Qiming really excels, or they've gotten so expensive that we would not have an interest in playing in those sectors. So that's how to think about Qiming and where we are actually playing at this time. The most important thing to realize about Qiming, however, is that within Qiming, the priority has always been the culture. So when we look at what we have built, we have a very team-oriented culture. The managing partners and partners are paid virtually the same. We have a sector focus, so we focus on really deep technical teams going into the healthcare and technology areas. But the sense that we want everyone to have is that if you're part of Qiming, you're really part of a team. And thus far, that's worked out very well for us. When we were talking about earlier how venture capital has come back and is now fully operational in China, that's a function of the capital that's coming in, but I can't overemphasize how important it has been for the Star Board and the Hong Kong Exchange to step up and allow earlier stage companies that still have technology risk associated with them list. That was always the big hole in the Chinese capital market structure for entrepreneurism. You had to be profitable in order to list. And when you look back at the history in the United States of successful technology companies, very, very few of them were profitable at the time they listed. That was something that they tapped the capital markets for the capital in order to expand and develop their models further. And so the fact that China now has exchanges that allow that to happen has been a huge benefit to the overall Chinese venture capital industry. The drive for the tech independence, again, that's coming somewhat from the Chinese government. That's also created a very huge incentive for Chinese entrepreneurs. It's created a challenge as well, because the challenge is if you're not going to just look at what's happened in the US or license or adapt that technology, then you're going to have to be a little more creative and a little more focused on what you're doing yourself. That can be very challenging. I think the Chinese entrepreneurs are proven that they're very up to the task and very well suited to this particular environment. But this is clearly something that we think for enterprise software, data analytics, and a number of areas, the desire for independence, semiconductors, the desire for independence has created a real opening for the entrepreneurs in China because one of the major competitors, foreign imports, is slowly being done away with. So we think that that has created a very rich environment in the technology area. Healthcare, pretty much the same story. Although thus far in the US-China discussions that I'm part of, healthcare has not been the focus in terms of restricting access to drugs or access to therapies or access to technology between the two countries. Thus far, fortunately, I think healthcare has stayed a bit out of that fray, and I'm certainly hoping that that will continue in the future. So what can go wrong as we're looking at all this? Decoupling. I'm not a fan. I don't believe it's desirable. I don't believe it's possible, but it's certainly the rhetoric on both sides of both the US and China. That rhetoric associated with decoupling has ramped up dramatically. What many academics don't understand, and what many people who are not in the technology industry don't understand, is that technology is like water. It is very, very difficult to restrain it. So when you're looking, technology wants to move, technology wants to flow. And so I think that the idea that we're going to somehow restrict access to technology, we're going to somehow eliminate or constrain the development of technology, I don't think that that's practical. So decoupling as an idea that we're going to have parallel universes between the US and China, I would certainly hope we don't wind up going down that path. Will there be differences in how China might do enterprise software compared to the United States? Of course, that's kind of common sense. And as China markets mature, there'll be some more of those differences. But that we fundamentally have different 5G standards. We have different norms for cell therapy and gene therapy. We have different true different standards. I don't really see that happening, and I think that would be a real mistake for both countries and for the world's market, as we go forward. So the real focus to me when we're talking about decoupling is we should be focused on standards and norms. Who owns your data? Those are things that the world could agree. Individuals have certain rights to their data. That within a certain country, the government might have some access, but other countries, other individuals shouldn't necessarily have access to that. And we should be focused on solving some of the large global problems, which require us to share more and more data and have more interactions, not less. Cryptocurrency or crypto technology is another area where we'll have to have some standards. Having incompatible financial systems or payment systems is not in anyone's benefit. The other area where there's a great deal of discussion and how in terms of separation, is on supply chain and supply chain relocations. You hear a great deal of discussion in the academic community about supply chains and relocating supply chains. But when you ask the academics, how many of you have ever built one? The answer is usually zero. And it's something that until you realize the supply chain is 70% dealing with people, 30% dealing with the geography. Until you realize that, you really don't understand what you have to do with supply chains. We've gone through globalization 1.0 now, which was very much around cost reduction. Supply chains were put in places so people could save money on manufacturing. Now we're moving to globalization 2.0, and it's on market access, it's on security, and it requires a much more strategic approach to how we think about supply chains. And I think that that's just a fundamental difference that people aren't understanding. It's also going to take much longer to move supply chains in general. And we shouldn't hope that it happens in a very willy-nilly or random fashion. I'm pretty sure that the focus on supply chains will be more strategic, which will imply a more thoughtful approach to that issue. So in conclusion, I would say I'm very optimistic. I think that China has consistently exceeded my expectations in terms of the entrepreneurial community, the venture capital community, and just the energy, the drive, the ambition of the group of people that I've had the good fortune to be associated with the last 20 years of doing venture capital in China. I would also say that when I look at US-China today, I look at those relationships, the discussions that I've been part of within the potential Biden administration, I'm actually very optimistic on the opportunity set as well. We need to take the approach, and I'm speaking a little bit more about the US than China. The US needs to really take the approach now to examine and improve a whole range of systems. We have economic systems, social systems, and technology systems that COVID has provided a very bright, painful light in which to view. And when you look at that, you realize these things need to change at the systems level. It's not a quick and easy fix. I'd submit to you that China is going to have its own examples now. And so this is a great opportunity for the US and China together to step back and say, what could we fix? We have things that China needs to fix for itself, things the US needs to fix for itself. And there are some things that we should really work on together to fix for not only the two countries, but for the world. With that, I wish you a very good forum. Again, it's a real pleasure and honor for me to have been invited to speak, and say thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I know that there was a little bit of a technical difficulty as with anything technology-wise. So everyone, I think we could actually hear him okay for that little part right there, but the audio signal, we just had to tweak a little bit. So thank you so much, everyone, for being patient. And I know that there's actually questions that's actually coming through from the audience, so I'll leave that for Gary to actually attend to. So back to you. So please pick the question, and I won't spoil anything. I'll leave it to you. Let's take a look at the questions that we have. I know because, and just as a gentle reminder for everyone that's at home, one more thing I forgot is that if there's too many questions that's coming in, there's probably no way that we can actually attend to all of them. So we'll try our best and actually pick out the ones that we can answer given the circumstances. That we really appreciate everyone's understanding. And so just keep the questions coming, because I know everyone at home that's actually, listening, there's probably things that you want to ask. There's definitely places where you can do that. And so there's questions for Rebecca. So from Rebecca, so let's take a look at that and see what we have going on.
Gary, I have a follow-up question for you. Since you have lived in Shanghai and you've lived in the US and you have come back to the US now, I'm interested in how your perspective on US technology development and innovation has changed now that you're back in the US. Do you have a different perspective on it than when you were in China?
Thanks, Rebecca. I don't think much has changed from the standpoint of an entrepreneur in Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, or China. I think the focus has to be on you're going to have a great market opportunity. You're going to have a great deal of uncertainty. The network effect and the sensing skill of the Chinese entrepreneurs in understanding what may be coming at them from a legal perspective, market perspective, competitive perspective. I think that should hold them in good stead in this time as we go forward. I think it's also important to now more than ever to admit what you don't know, because clearly COVID in 2020 was a huge surprise for the globe. I'm not sure we're done with it. I'm not sure we're done with the repercussions of it. So I wouldn't be making assumptions with 90% certainty, because I'm not sure 90% certainty exists in 2021 in the entrepreneurial community.
Gary, thank you so much for those enlightening remarks. You really covered the landscape. There are so many points to digest about the tech and venture and entrepreneurship for the future going into next year and beyond. Let's give Gary a round of applause. Thank you again, Gary, and thank you, audience out there, for listening.